The soft light of early morning gently bathed the hospital room, illuminating the three women who stood vigil by the bed. The man lying there, once robust and muscular, now appeared frail, his body ravaged by cancer. A petite brunette in her late 40s cradled his hand against her cheek, her curly shoulder-length hair partially hiding her tear-streaked face. Seated beside her was a younger version of the woman, likely in her late 20s. On the opposite side of the bed stood a tall, attractive blonde, around 30 years old, who bore a striking resemblance to the man. With great tenderness, she wiped her father's bald head. The quiet watch was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A tall blonde man poked his head in and whispered to the blonde, "Sis, is he awake?" "Not right now, Eric," Kelsey replied quietly. "He only wakes up for brief moments. The morphine keeps him mostly asleep." Eric turned to the older brunette. "Holly," he said softly, "can we come in?" She looked up at him with a weak smile and nodded. He stepped back, holding the door open as a woman in her early 50s entered the room hesitantly. Her long hair, streaked with blonde and silver, hung loosely around her shoulders, and despite her age, her figure was still one to be envied by women much younger. "Holly," she greeted softly. "Naomi, come in," Kelsey said, standing up and exchanging a glance with Holly. Holly gave a reassuring nod. Kelsey turned back to Naomi. "You can sit here, Mom." "Thanks, Kelsey." What followed was a subtle, silent dance, a human chess game. Every movement toward the bed caused another to shift in response, as if all were carefully navigating their emotional positions. Finally, the room settled. Naomi took a seat on the opposite side of the bed from Holly and her daughter, Melissa. Kelsey moved to one corner of the room, while Eric sat in the other. "Thank you for letting me come," Naomi said softly. "When the kids told me Dean was spending whatever time he had left at home, I knew I had to see him." "It was the right thing to do," Holly answered tiredly. Dean agreed. "He didn't want any visitors once he's back home later today, so I'm glad you were able to make it before he's discharged." A soft groan escaped the man in the bed as his eyes fluttered open. Eyes that had not met in over a decade now locked onto one another. "Naomi," he rasped weakly. "I'm here, Dean," she whispered. "Where's Holly?" "I'm right here, honey," his wife replied, gently patting his hand. He smiled faintly, his gaze softening as he looked into her eyes. Slowly he glanced around the room, noting everyone's presence. "We are gathered here today," he said, his voice barely audible, though it sparked a few quiet chuckles around the room. He sighed deeply, then cleared his throat and shifted his gaze to Naomi. "All right, Naomi," he said in a strained voice. "Say what you need to say. I might drift off, though. I can't seem to stay awake." "I understand, Dean," Naomi said softly. "I'll be brief. And don't worry if you fall asleep. Most of what I need to say is for the kids anyway." He gave a small nod, and she took a deep breath. "Dean, I just wanted to say goodbye. We already did that 10 years ago." "Yes," she acknowledged, her voice trembling slightly. "But when I heard you were dying, I realized I still had things I needed to say." "I need your forgiveness," she said, her voice now barely a whisper. "Please, Dean, tell me you forgive me." For a moment, they stared at each other in silence before Dean let out a soft sigh. "You're forgiven," he said, his voice hoarse. Naomi sat back, clearly taken aback by the simplicity of his response. "Just like that?" she asked in disbelief. He let out a small, dry laugh. "No, not just like that. It took years for me to be able to say that and mean it. Holly was a big part of it." He winced in pain, letting out a stifled groan before pressing the button for his morphine drip. Within moments, his breathing slowed and his face relaxed. Minutes later, he drifted back to sleep. "I'm sorry, Naomi," Holly said gently. "He'll be out for a while now. I know it wasn't exactly what you were hoping for." Naomi shook her head, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Actually, it's more than I ever hoped for. I only dreamed of hearing him say he forgave me. I know I have you to thank for that." Holly shook her head. "No, Naomi, I couldn't make Dean do something he didn't truly want to do. Sure, he'll do things for me that he'd rather not, but never anything that goes against what he believes is right. Well, I'm still thankful he found someone like you after I lost him." "You didn't lose his love, Mother," Kelsey snapped bitterly. "You threw it away." "I know, Kelsey," Naomi replied sadly. "And that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. We all have regrets, don't we?" Kelsey snorted and sat back, her lips tightly pressed together as if she had just bitten into something sour. "Sweetheart," Naomi began, her voice soft yet firm, "we all have regrets. Things we wish we hadn't done, or situations we hoped would turn out differently. Some of those regrets stem from circumstances beyond our control, while others are entirely our doing. My biggest regret is that I allowed myself to lose control during those months." "Don't try to excuse it," Kelsey cut in sharply. "I'm not excusing anything," Naomi replied calmly. "I take full responsibility for what I did. But my thinking was severely messed up at the time. There were a lot of things happening back then. Things that I doubt you or Eric were fully aware of. Your father and I never gave you the full picture. Dean chose not to because he believed I had wronged him, not you two, since you were both out of the house by then. And I didn't tell you because, frankly, I feared you would hate me even more than you already do." "I don't hate you, Mother," Kelsey responded coldly. "I hate what you did. But I will never just sit quietly and let anyone minimize the pain and devastation your actions caused, to Dad, to Eric, and to me." Naomi lowered her head for a moment, her voice breaking as she replied, "I never considered how much pain my actions would cause. I'm sorry for that." "How could you not?" Eric asked, his voice calm but laced with disappointment. "You had to know that cheating on Dad would destroy him. Our family meant everything to him." Naomi nodded slowly. "You're right. Deep down, I knew. I knew it was wrong, but I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to face the consequences. It wasn't until I was already in the affair that I truly realized the danger I had put my marriage in. By that time, it was far too late." "During the divorce," she continued, "everyone kept asking me why I did something so terrible. Back then I had nothing but pathetic excuses. But after 10 years of reflecting on it, I have a clearer idea of what led me to that moment." "I'm not offering an excuse," she said, meeting Kelsey's icy gaze, "but I think it's important for you to know how it happened. Up until now, I didn't want to admit the truth because it makes me look as shallow and selfish as I was. Simply put, a series of things came together at the same time, presenting me with an opportunity I foolishly embraced." "Naomi," Holly interjected gently, "you're a beautiful woman. I'm sure you had plenty of opportunities to be unfaithful over the years." Naomi gave a weak smile. "Thank you, Holly, and yes, I did. But this was different. Dean had taken a large contract that required him to travel again. We had talked about it, and I agreed. It was for Kelsey and Eric's college tuition. It was only for 6 months, but it hit me harder than I ever expected. Earlier in our marriage, when he traveled, I had the kids at home with me. But this time, with both of you in college, I felt old and utterly alone." She paused for a moment before continuing. "At work, a younger man started paying attention to me. His name was Colin. I knew he was only interested in one thing, but having someone like him, a handsome, successful rising star, showing interest in me was intoxicating." Kelsey snorted again, her expression hardening as Eric's disappointment became even more evident. Naomi pressed on. "I know it sounds ridiculous," Naomi said softly, looking from one child to the other. "I was selfish and arrogant. I don't expect this to excuse what I did, but I hope you understand how I let it happen. It had nothing to do with your father's actions or anything he failed to do. It was all about my own fears and insecurities. I never stopped loving him, not even during the affair." "How can you say that, Mom?" Kelsey sneered. "You were sleeping with another man." "I know it sounds impossible to you," Naomi answered, her voice heavy with regret, "but it's the truth. I did love your father. The problem wasn't that I didn't love him. It was that I loved myself more. I prioritized my own needs and desires above everyone else's. For 4 months, I let my own unhappiness justify betraying my marriage vows. When I finally came to my senses and ended the affair, it was too late. The damage had already been done. I thought I could hide it, keep the secret, and spare your father from the truth. But I knew deep down there was a good chance he would divorce me if he ever found out." "Then why tell him?" Eric asked quietly, his eyes full of sadness. "Was it just to ease your guilt?" "No, Eric. It wasn't just about my guilt," Naomi replied, shaking her head. "Of course, the guilt was unbearable, and your father could tell something was wrong after that contract ended. Our marriage became tense, and I realized sooner or later I'd have to come clean. But in the end, it wasn't me who forced the confession. It was fate." Naomi took a deep breath before continuing. When I ended the affair with Colin, I made one thing clear. He was never to have any contact with Dean, and they were never to work together. Our company had contracted with your father's firm a few times in the past, and the thought of Dean having to answer to Colin was something I couldn't bear. Colin would always know our secret, and I didn't want him to use that to disrespect Dean. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? After I had already disrespected him for those months. The room fell silent for a moment, heavy with unspoken pain. Naomi continued. Colin agreed, of course. I thought everything would be fine if I could just deal with the guilt and move forward. But then, that government contract came up, the one worth millions. I knew Colin would be leading the GSA project if we won it, and I knew Dean's company would be involved. Once we secured the bid, my worst fears came true. Dean was announced as the lead engineer for the project, and of course, he would be answering directly to Colin. Her voice trembled as she recalled the events. I confronted Colin, reminding him of our agreement, but he shrugged it off. He said business was business and refused to step aside. I don't think he ever believed I'd actually follow through with my threat, but he was wrong. Naomi paused, her eyes filling with tears, the memories visibly painful to recount. Your father handled my confession just as I expected, calm and measured. He sat there, listening, asking questions. I could tell he was gathering everything he needed before making his decision, but when I saw a tear slide down his cheek, I knew it was over. The next day, he withdrew from the project. I don't know if he did it to protect his company or if he sensed the storm that was about to hit. Either way, it ended up being the best move he could have made. All hell broke loose after that. She wiped her face and continued. Dean's decision to step down created a massive stir. He was a key part of that team, and when he backed out, it raised a lot of questions. Both our companies got involved, and when the executives started looking into things, it didn't take long for them to uncover my affair with Colin. That's when the nightmare I'd feared became a reality. As expected, Colin was removed from the project. Dean's company, on the other hand, benefited greatly. The embarrassment of the whole situation led my company to offer his firm a larger percentage of the contract, and Dean was promoted. It worked out for him in ways I could never have imagined. And what about you? Eric asked, his voice cold. Colin and I didn't fare nearly as well, Naomi admitted, her voice soft. We were effectively blacklisted. Colin's father-in-law was furious, and he used his influence to ruin both of our careers. Colin was sent off to every terrible project in third world countries for years. He eventually gave up, divorced his wife, and the last I heard, he was selling insurance in Detroit. As for me, they promoted me, more as a way to avoid a lawsuit than to reward me. But it was a hollow promotion. I was pushed into an office where I barely saw the light of day. The money's decent, but my career is dead. There's no future for me in the company. She paused, looking around the room, trying to gauge how her confession was being received. Melissa's face was tight with frustration, clearly uncomfortable hearing how her stepfather had been wronged. Holly's expression was measured, clearly aware of most of the story. But it was Kelsey and Eric's reactions that made Naomi falter. The hurt and disappointment in their eyes were almost too much to bear. Gathering herself, Naomi pressed on. If I thought work was bad, home was even worse. My marriage was disintegrating before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to save it. She glanced down, her voice quieter now. Dean tried to talk to me a few times after he filed for divorce. I apologized again and again, telling him it was my fault, that none of it was on him. But he just looked at me and said, "If our marriage was so wonderful, why wasn't it enough to keep you out of Colin's bed?" That cut deep. I understood why he was angry and bitter, but it still hurt. Naomi took a shaky breath. He asked me why I did it, and all I could give him were excuses. After that, he cut off all communication. I was furious, mad at myself for causing all this, and mad at Dean for not trying to save what we had. "Oh, please, Mother," Kelsey interrupted sharply. "If Dad had cheated on you, would you have forgiven him and fought for the marriage?" Naomi shook her head slowly, a sad smile forming on her lips. "We both know the answer to that, sweetheart. If the roles had been reversed, I would have been much more vindictive. I would have tried to make your father suffer in ways he never did to me." Kelsey looked ready to respond, but Eric spoke first, his tone gentle but firm. "I said I was disappointed, Mom, not that I didn't understand why Dad reacted the way he did. I couldn't blame him. I was just angry because I could see our 20-year marriage circling the drain, and I knew I was the one who pulled the plug. But I was furious at my helplessness to stop it. Only Dad had the power to save it, and he chose not to. Naomi nodded. You know, if he'd really wanted to make my life unbearable, he would have taken me back. There were soft gasps from around the room. Kelsey sneered. You've always had a way with words, haven't you, Mother? That's not what I meant, Kelsey, and you know it, Naomi said, tears welling in her eyes. Eric, standing behind her, asked gently, What did you mean, Mom? Naomi wiped at her tears before answering. I would have done anything to make amends with your father. I would have degraded myself, done things that would shame even an old Tijuana 304, just to have a chance at regaining his love. But I knew from the moment I told him about the affair that it would never happen. Even through my tears, I saw the devastation in his eyes. The moment his love for me died. Our marriage ended right then. I could see it in him. Eric spoke softly. He had to move on, Mom. We all did. I know, Naomi replied, nodding sadly. And I know I've had my own struggles with moving on. You kids have helped me through that. And for that, I'm grateful. I know you were angry at me, furious even, and you had every right to be. But you didn't abandon me. I don't know if I would have survived that. I'm thankful Dean didn't turn you against me. Dad would have never done that, Eric said quietly with certainty. No, Naomi agreed, shaking her head. That wasn't in his nature. She smiled weakly at Eric before turning to Holly. Did you know I prayed for over a year that somehow I could get my marriage back? I begged God to change Dean's heart and give me another chance. I knew I didn't deserve it, but it's what I desperately wanted. Then Kelsey told me Dean had started dating you, Holly. That's when I knew my prayers wouldn't be answered. It wasn't until after you and Dean got married that I finally tried to move on. Naomi paused, looking at Holly with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. I started dating again, and that's when I realized just how special my marriage had been before I ruined it. I dated quite a bit, but it never worked. Every time I'd end up comparing them to Dean, and it wouldn't last long after that. There's a certain intimacy that only comes with time, a kind of closeness where someone knows exactly what you need, whether it's a passionate embrace or a gentle touch. You can't replicate that easily. She sighed deeply, her face lined with regret. There's nothing more humbling than craving that kind of intimacy and realizing you'll never have it again. Not because someone doesn't care, but because they don't know you well enough to understand. And knowing I was the reason that was gone, it haunted me. Every romantic relationship I've had since has had to start from scratch, and it's my fault. Some relationships seemed promising, she continued, her voice quiet. I was even proposed to twice, but I turned them both down. Why? Holly asked, her expression concerned. Naomi let out a long sigh. It's complicated. Part of it was because I was still in love with Dean. Mother, Kelsey scolded, her tone sharp. No, Naomi snapped back, her eyes flashing. You don't get to tell me what I already know. You can't say anything I haven't told myself 1,000 times over. I loved your father. I still do, and I always will. I know it doesn't change anything, but that's the truth. I'll always carry the guilt of what I did, but I'm learning to live with it. In some ways, I've moved on. In others, I'm still stuck. Kelsey, Holly spoke softly, trying to diffuse the tension. It's okay, I'm not jealous. I know how much your daddy loves me. Naomi flinched slightly, but composed herself before continuing. I know that, Holly. I've come to terms with the fact that you will always have Dean's love. It's one of the things that makes me jealous, but I understand it's a consequence of my own choices. I don't want anyone thinking my lingering feelings for Dean or why I turned down those marriage proposals. It goes deeper than that. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I've asked myself the same question everyone here probably has. If I truly loved Dean, how could I betray him like I did? I still don't have an answer I can live with. So, when I compared the love I felt for those men who proposed to me with what I felt for Dean, it fell short every time. And if I couldn't stay faithful to Dean, how could I promise fidelity to anyone else? I cared about those men enough to know it wouldn't have been fair to them. Turning down their proposals was the right thing to do. Holly, her face softened with empathy, spoke gently. I'm sorry, Naomi. I'm sorry you're going through that. Naomi smiled sadly, her eyes misty. It's easy to see why Dean fell in love with you, Holly. You're as beautiful on the inside as you are on the outside." "Thank you," Holly replied, though her expression showed discomfort. "But please don't make me out to be a saint. I've had my own regrets, especially when it comes to my first marriage, but there's one that involves Dean, too." "Mom?" Melissa asked, her voice alarmed. Holly quickly reassured her. "No, it's not something terrible, but it is something I'm not proud of. Since Naomi has been brave enough to share her regrets, I'll follow her lead." She paused, searching for the right words. "It happened a few months after Dean and I started dating. Things had been pretty heated between us, but we hadn't had sex," Melissa said with a mischievous smile. "You mean bumping uglies?" Kelsey quipped, snickering. "Hiding the sausage? Doing it?" Melissa added with a smirk. "Girls," Holly gasped, her cheeks flushing. "Knocking boots?" Melissa continued, grinning. "Hitting it? Making babies?" Kelsey chimed in, laughing. "Girls!" Holly exclaimed, her face bright red, while Eric chuckled along with them. Naomi, meanwhile, looked down, her discomfort apparent. Trying to regain her composure, Holly pressed on. "What I was trying to say is that Dean and I hadn't yet been intimate. I knew it had been a long time for both of us, and the sexual tension between us was definitely complicating things. Then, one day, I overheard him on a phone call." Her expression grew more serious as she continued. "At first, I thought he was talking to you, Kelsey, but now I'm not sure who it was. What I do remember is Dean talking about possibly reconciling with Naomi." Naomi flinched again, but said nothing. Holly continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew I loved Dean, but I was terrified after what had happened in my first marriage. Even though my ex-husband had abandoned us years earlier, I hadn't let another man in as closely as I had Dean. I knew he was a good man, and I didn't want to lose him. So I made a decision, one I'm not entirely proud of. I decided that he was mine, and I wasn't going to lose him to anyone else." She paused again, her voice quieter now. "That week, I shamelessly threw myself at him, hoping to claim him for myself. I seduced him." Melissa, still smiling, interjected, "Mom, I seriously doubt Dad needed much seducing. Every time I saw you two, you were always touching each other." "Yeah, seriously, Holly," Kelsey added, grinning. "Daddy never seemed able to keep his hands off you." Holly blushed as she replied, "Your father has always been very affectionate." "Affectionate? Is that another word for horny?" Melissa teased, making Eric and Kelsey laugh again. "Mel," Holly scolded, though she was clearly flustered. The three adult children laughed, but Naomi's discomfort deepened as she shifted in her seat. "Mom," Melissa said, still smiling, "I don't see why you'd regret showing Dad how much you wanted him." Holly's smile faded slightly. "Sweetheart, I don't regret that. What I regret is that it took the fear of losing him to push me to that point. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't taken that step. Would Dean have waited for me, or would he have gone back to Naomi? Whatever the answer, I hope he would have found happiness. I know I have, more than I could have ever imagined." Eric leaned forward, his voice soft and warm. "Holly, Dad always says you and Mel saved him." Holly nodded, letting out a soft laugh. "I know Dean says I saved him," she said warmly, "but the truth is he saved me too. After my ex left, I struggled with trust for years. I dated on and off. But there was always that wall between me and the men I met. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only wanted for one thing. But then Dean came along, and he shattered all of those doubts." Naomi chuckled at her stepdaughter's grin. "What?" Holly asked, clearly puzzled. Melissa smirked. "Oh, nothing. Sure, Dad wanted you for more than just sex, but I bet that didn't hurt." Holly's eyes widened, realizing what Melissa was implying. "Melissa Dawson, behave," she exclaimed, fighting back a shy smile as her face turned red. Eric, Kelsey, and Melissa all laughed at Holly's embarrassment. "Your father's love has been so much more than that," Holly said, still blushing but with a sincere smile. "He's been a wonderful husband and father, even through his illness. I couldn't have asked for a better, more loving partner. He's made these last 8 years the happiest I've ever had." Naomi's smile faded slightly as she spoke softly. "I never knew Dean seriously considered reconciling with me. I wonder who he would have been talking to about that." Kelsey crossed her arms and spoke with a hint of sarcasm. "Well, since this has turned into Jerry Springer family confession time, it was probably me. Daddy and I talked a lot about it." Holly raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize you were so involved in his decisions back then." Kelsey sighed, exchanging a glance with Melissa before turning back to Holly. More than you might think, she said quietly. Dad was at a crossroads, trying to decide whether to live in the past or move forward. He told me he was falling in love with you, Holly, and that if he didn't make a decision soon, he'd probably ask you to marry him. But he still had feelings for Mom. He said, "You can't be married to someone for that long and not still feel something." Kelsey paused, her expression softening as she remembered. I asked him what those feelings were. He said they used to be purely love, but now they were a tangled mix of love, hate, bitterness, anger, and exhaustion. He wasn't sure if he should try to work through all of that with Mom or start fresh with you. I pushed him toward you, Holly. I didn't hate Mom, but I saw what her affair did to him. It nearly destroyed him. He seemed strong, but inside, he was breaking. That summer after the affair, I stayed with him. I can't count how many nights I found him crying alone in his room. He never cried in front of anyone, but I'd sit outside his door, listening to him sob and cry with him. Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes as she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. I knew I'd hurt him, but I never saw that kind of pain in him. That's because he didn't want you to see it, Kelsey replied. He didn't want you to have the satisfaction of knowing how deeply you'd wounded him. I never meant to hurt him like that, Naomi said, her voice breaking. I was selfish, thinking only of what I wanted, but I never wanted to destroy him. Mom, Kelsey said firmly, whether you intended to or not, the damage was done. So, when he had to choose between going back to a wife who had cheated on him or starting a new life with someone who loved him and would never betray him, I pushed him toward Holly. I knew it would take months, if not years, to rebuild the trust between you two, and I didn't want to see him go through that. I do regret pushing him a little, but not enough to say I'm sorry. This wasn't about you, Mom. It was about Dad's happiness, and I knew he'd be happier with Holly than trying to salvage the past with you. Holly smiled gently. Kelsey, I didn't realize you'd played matchmaker so well. I'm torn between scolding you and giving you a big hug. Melissa jumped in, a mischievous glint in her eye. Well, she didn't do it alone. I've got a confession of my own. Holly looked surprised. You, Mel? Melissa nodded. Yep. Remember when I met Kelsey in college? She was tutoring me in my freshman year, and we became friends. She came over to the house a lot, and I started noticing how she watched you. When I asked her about it, she told me that she thought you and her dad would be perfect together. I didn't like the idea of you being left alone when I moved out, so I started to agree with her. Eric smiled and chimed in. Well, it looks like you two weren't just studying together after all. I guess that was when we hatched our little plan to get you two together, Melissa continued, a playful glint in her eye. We figured we'd see if there was any chemistry between you and Dean. I had gone out with Eric a couple of times before Kelsey invited me to stay the weekend at their house. And when I first met Dean, I fell for him immediately. Kelsey snorted with laughter. She fell for him almost as fast as you did, Holly. Melissa grinned. Actually, I fell for him a full week faster than Mom did. It took her that long to pull her head out of the clouds and admit she loved him. Melissa, language, Holly said, trying to sound stern but unable to hide a small smile. Mel stuck her tongue out playfully before continuing. Anyway, since I was already hooked, Kelsey and I began plotting. We came up with the idea to invite you, me, and Mom for a weekend visit. The cover story was that I was really into Eric and wanted Mom to meet him. Melissa turned toward Eric with an apologetic look. I'm sorry, Eric. I guess I never really apologized for making it seem like I was more serious about us than I actually was. You were great, and I was definitely attracted to you, but you didn't love me, Eric interjected, his tone understanding. I knew something was off. I cared more for you than you did for me, but that first visit to my house really threw me. After seeing the way you and Dad interacted, I was even more confused. Let's just say it's a bit rough on a guy's ego when his girlfriend falls harder for his dad than for him. He paused, smiling softly. But after your next visit with your mom, I finally got it. Until then, I was worried I'd fallen for someone with serious daddy issues. Melissa laughed. I guess in a way, I did. Not many 19-year-olds change their last name when their mom remarries, especially when we didn't even live under the same roof. But Dean, Dad, has been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was. Eric smiled, glancing between Melissa and Holly. Yeah, well, after seeing you and Mom and watching how my dad reacted to both of you, it was obvious. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him smile like that. The room was filled with bittersweet smiles, as the shared memories evoked both happiness and regret. Well, Eric said after a moment, his voice quieter, since everyone's sharing their confessions, I guess it's my turn. All eyes turned toward Eric, curiosity piqued. He cleared his throat dramatically. I just wanted to let you all know that next week you'll probably see something in the papers that might shock you. And yes, it's true. I'm the lost Kardashian sister, and I'm engaged to Bruce. Oops, I mean Caitlyn Marie Jenner. Kelsey snorted, and the room burst into laughter, a welcome relief from the heavy emotions earlier. Just like his father, Naomi and Holly said simultaneously, catching each other by surprise. Eric smiled broadly. Thanks, I can't think of a better compliment. The room gradually quieted again, and the atmosphere became a bit more somber. Naomi stood gracefully and offered a small, sad smile. Holly, she began, her voice soft, thank you again for allowing me to come today. I'm still trying to move forward, and this meeting was a big step. Thank you for making it possible. Holly nodded warmly. You're welcome, Naomi. I hope this brings you some peace and helps you move on. Dean made the final decision, and we both thought something good could come from this. If he hadn't agreed, I wouldn't have either. I'll always protect him from being hurt. Naomi's voice trembled as she whispered, I wish I'd been that fiercely loyal. She turned to her son. Eric, can you drive me back to my hotel? Eric nodded and began gathering his things as Naomi cast a long, lingering look at Dean's frail form, still sleeping in the bed. Holly, Naomi said quietly, please tell Dean he's in my prayers. You and Melissa are too. I will, Naomi. And thank you, Holly replied sincerely. As Naomi and Eric left the room, the quietness that followed was heavy with unresolved emotions, yet there was a subtle sense of closure in the air. Naomi slowly exited the room, her steps heavy with the weight of finality. Once the door closed behind her, the emotions she had been holding back overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as quiet sobs escaped her. She knew this was the last time she would ever see the love of her life alive. 2.5 weeks later, Dean Scott Dawson, at the age of 53, passed away peacefully in his sleep at home, surrounded by his loving family. The graveside service had been a bittersweet occasion. Holly sat between Melissa and Kelsey in the front row, her face etched with grief, yet filled with quiet strength. To the surprise of some in attendance, Naomi sat in the front row as well, positioned between Kelsey and Eric. After the service, friends and family offered their condolences before heading to the family reception, leaving the immediate family to their private mourning. Now, outside by the limousines, all 3 of Dean's adult children stood around Holly. Holly, Kelsey began gently, her voice soft but full of gratitude. Thank you. I never thought I'd see Daddy smile again after the divorce, but you and Mel brought joy back into his life. You reminded him he could love again. There was no doubt he loved you both so deeply. Holly reached over and took Kelsey's hand tenderly. Never forget how much he loved you and Eric. He was always so proud of the 2 of you. We know, Eric said, a sad smile on his face. But divorces are hard on everyone. Even though Kelsey and I had already left home, their divorce still hit us hard. We wanted to be there for Dad because he was so hurt, but we couldn't always be. We're grateful he found you and that he wasn't alone. Eric's expression softened as he added, we also want to thank you for how kind you've been to Mom these past few weeks. You gave her the chance to say goodbye to Dad and to be part of honoring his life today. Not many people would have done that for an ex. Holly smiled gently, her eyes filling with tears. Oh, sweetheart, your dad and I knew how important it was for you, Eric, and even for your mom. We wanted to make sure everyone had the chance to say goodbye. It means more than you can imagine, Kelsey added softly. When Daddy fell in love with you, he was able to move on. But Mom never fully did. I think letting her be a part of this, letting her say goodbye, might give her the chance to heal too. Holly, not only did you give my daddy a new life, but you might have given my mom the same opportunity. Holly's lips trembled and her voice cracked as she tried to respond. Your father and I love you both so, she broke down into sobs. I love you both so much, she whispered. Unable to hold back her grief, Holly leaned against the limo, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I'm going to miss him so much, she wept. Eric stepped forward, wrapping his strong arms around her, and she buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Kelsey and Melissa held each other tightly, their own tears flowing as they watched Holly grieve. Slowly, after a few moments, Holly began to regain her composure. The group turned their attention to a solitary figure kneeling beside the gravesite. It was Naomi, her hands gently caressing the cold marble headstone, her quiet sobs barely audible as she whispered to the man she once called husband. Without a word, Kelsey and Eric quietly walked over and stood beside their mother, one on either side of her. Kelsey knelt down and gently touched her mother's arm. "Mama," she whispered softly, "it's time to go."